megaherbs are just recovering incredibly, they're just spreading out over the island. So the first thing is the visual thing with vegetation changes, but then you go there and you see the bird life. The pipits are probably the first thing you see all over the place. But the thing that really makes my heart sing was when you walk around there and you see the Campbell Island snipe, up at the Northwest Bay Circuit. Normally now I'd see 10 or a dozen snipe walking that trip. We're seeing the Campbell Island teal that was gone from the island, so seeing those guys coming back, it's fantastic.
Kia ora. Hello. Welcome to Campbell Island, the southernmost of New Zealand's Subantarctic Islands. Join us as we take a look at megaherbs, majestic birds, and the jagged history from destruction to preservation.
In this Conservation Amplified video, we're sharing the remarkable story of Campbell Island, located south of New Zealand in the Subantarctic Island group. First, we'll look at the biodiversity and the impacts of early human history. We'll then move on to the rat eradication program and how that influenced the international island eradication landscape. We'll look at how it recovered and what this means for the future. And then lastly, how you can visit the islands, should you wish. Let's take a look.
The waters around New Zealand, and particularly New Zealand's Subantarctic Islands, are the epicenter of seabird diversity full stop on the planet. So there's nowhere richer. And Campbell Island itself has 6 species of breeding albatross. So it has almost the entire world population of southern royal albatross. It has the entire world population of Campbell albatross. And then it has grey-headed, black-browed, light-mantled sooty, and a few breeding Antipodeans, which mix in with the southern royals as well. So an incredible diversity, and they're exploiting different niches on the island as well. So you've got the endemic shag, so Campbell Island shag. We have also got the few forest birds, so scrub birds, things like the silver eye, but also Campbell Island pipit, which is a subspecies or full species, depending on your taxonomic persuasions of the New Zealand pipit. Then we've got the snipe as well, so that was long thought extinct before being refound and now naturally recolonising mainland Campbell from Jacamar Island. And that's pretty widespread across the island, and it's an incredible little bird that spends its entire life just foraging low in the tussocks in the wet areas. And when we've got the endemic and flightless Campbell Island teal as well, which again, driven right to the verge of extinction. A tiny population was found on Daunt Island, and they were taken into captivity and then basically bred up and then recolonised Campbell both naturally and with the help of introductions.
Just like seabirds use Campbell Island as their breeding ground, New Zealand sea lions also stop by the island. They are the kings of the coast, and for good reason. The males are huge and can be rather dominant. They're also the rarest sea lion species in the world. Elephant seals are vagrants to the island as well, sometimes even bringing their offspring to rest along the coastline. But what about the plants that create a habitat for life to thrive?
It's covered in scrub, Dracophyllum scrub, so it's up to about 3 to 4 meters high, and that's as high as it gets.
As we move out of the scrub and towards the tussock, we see the stars of the show, the megaherbs.
Of course, this isn't a complete list of every species you'll find here. There are many types of invertebrates, like the Campbell Island weta, and some other birds present. Unfortunately, the natural balance of this fragile ecosystem was derailed by human arrival, and the mammals they brought with them, both intentionally and by accident. Invasive species like rats can wreak havoc on delicate ecosystems, and Campbell Island was no exception.
We don't know if Māori made it that far south or not. We haven't got any evidence they did, but it would probably seem remarkable if they didn't, given their history of exploration and the fact they were definitely on Enderby Island. Captain Hasselberg was the guy, the European that discovered it. He was a sealer. So really the whole history of the island started with the sealing. The seals were wiped out quite quickly, and then we were into a brief whaling interlude. In the 1860s was when we had a brief flurry attempt at farming, and that farming went on for pretty much 40 years. So there was a farming venture of some kind. About 7,000 sheep were taken there at one point. So a lot of sheep, there was some cattle taken. The next visitors really were the coast watchers in World War II. They came in and they were there for the duration of World War II, and they had a lookout there for enemy ships coming in. Happily none arrived, but during that time they did some really amazing stuff in terms of documenting the flora and fauna of the island. So some of our famous New Zealand scientists like Charles Fleming. Yeah, the next thing then was the Met Service came along there and used as a meteorological observation base, and they were there from sort of the late 40s right through till maybe the early 90s. That became automated in the 90s, and pretty much since then there's been no permanent occupation of the island. It's been conservationist and occasional visitations by Met Service to maintain the facility, and then the growth from the tourist industry. Well, I think it began in the 1970s was the birth of it, and that's sort of gradually been increasing to the current day. So it's capped at 600 visitors per year on the island, so that's as many as can go on there.
So when it came time to restore the island from the effects of our human history, there was much work to be done. Thousands of sheep and hundreds of cattle from the farming days were removed between 1970 and 1992.
And then in the early 90s there was discussion around could we get rid of the rats off the island, and so a lot of work went into plotting and planning to see if we could eradicate rats. It was only about 10 years prior to that, 1987, was the first sizable rat eradication in the world, which was on Breaksea Island. So only like about 200 hectares. And that was done with ground application of bait. And at the time it was seen as very aspirational, unlikely to succeed. It did succeed. And that was followed not long after by the likes of Kapiti and Kermadec Islands. They were about 3,000 or 2,500 hectares, so a big jump from 200, but that was using aerial baiting of poison. So it was pretty, Kapiti was only eradicated in in the 90s, but then the conversation began, can we get rid of them off Campbell Island? So I went down there initially in 1999, part of a team to assess the feasibility, to try and get an understanding of the rats that were there, how many were there, what the densities were, their reproductive biology, what sort of habitat were they living in, all those kinds of things. And in parallel with that, getting the trialling of potential eradication tools. So we were looking at different bait types, how that would behave in the weather conditions of the area. We wanted to trial a different approach to aerial sowing of the bait, so using much less bait than had been used previously. So what we did is the bait we used, the non-toxic baits, had rotamine dye in it.
Rotamine dye?
It's a biomarker, so it's basically a pink dye. And when the rats eat it, it stains their gut, and ultimately it stains their noses and their tails and their ears. So we could see whether whether the rats in that area had eaten the bait. So after doing the drop, we went through and we trapped in and around that area, trapped over 1,000 rats out of the area, and we checked them all to see whether they'd eaten the bait, as you know, we see from the biomarker in their gut. So it turned out they all had. So all the rats we trapped had eaten the bait in this trial area. That gave us a lot of confidence that approach we were using would be successful. The whole timing for the operation was winter, and that was deliberate. One of the things we sort of confirmed when we did that work was the rats, in a typical year, they start breeding in August. So that could vary, but that was a normal year, and that was the case when we were there. So we chose winter when the food was the least. There's the least birds are visiting there, and so they're the hungriest potentially, but also to minimise the risk of us having airstrikes and so on with birds. So we sort of confirmed a lot of that stuff on the timing, the methodology, went away, came back 2 years later with a full team, 20 odd of us there, so pilots and cooks and medics and field teams, etc., etc. And then essentially we were waiting for the weather. We budgeted on 3 months for the trip. It only take us a few days to do the drop, but of course the weather is normally either windy, wet, or calm and foggy down there. Not normally calm, to be fair, but when it is calm, it's often foggy as well. So we weren't too sure how long it would take for us to get a weather window to do the operation. We budgeted on 3 months. Ultimately, we were done and dusted within 6 weeks, so
wow.
That was pretty cool. Some days the weather would be unsuitable, we'd have to stop work. When that happened and we had to go back, when we went back again, we would do an overlap to try and cover any risk of reinvasion. So, yeah, basically that took 6 weeks of capture those weather windows, and then the job was done, and then it was a matter of all head off and hope, really. All the sowing was very much directed by GPS tracking, so we had GPS lines that would all pour over the maps every night and just make sure that the coverage had been complete. Sometimes we might see a wee gap that had been missed and send the pilots back. But the pilots we were using were extremely skilled and experienced, so they actually did an amazing job. You know, there's some very steep cliffs around, particularly on the sort of northwest side and the south side, massive big tall cliffs there, so they had to get in right close to those cliffs, often in windy conditions. So they were the heroes of the day, really, in terms of their flying was very challenging, and they did an amazing job.
When did you come back? And
We came back
what
2
happened?
years later, so the kind of protocol, even to this day, is when we're doing these rodent eradication, it's very hard to find one rat in 11,000 hectares. So the thinking is if you leave it 2 years, any survivors are likely to have bred up and their offspring have dispersed over a large enough area that we're going to be able to spot them. When we came back, we'd been suggested to us that the Campbell Island weta hadn't been seen on the main island for years, that it might recover. And night one we went outside, had a wander around with a torch and bounced around underneath the Dracophyllum bush were dozens of these Campbell Island wetas. So that gave us a real hint of hope that it was going to be all good. And then the following day we went out. We used to see roughly maybe a pipit, a little native skylark, maybe one every few days. We went out the next day and we were seeing pipits all over the place. So that was a massive change in 2 years. So the combination of the weta and the pipits gave us a whole lot of hope. And then we started to put out all our traps and our tracking devices, scoured the island. We had a wee dog with us, Jack the rat dog, and he was trained to find rats. We found no sign of rats anywhere on the island over a couple of months we were there, so it gave us real optimism that we'd done the job. Yeah, and that was kind of reinforced when we found the tracks of a snipe in 6 Foot Lake. Snipe hadn't ever been observed on Campbell Island. In fact, it had only been rediscovered in 1997, only 2 years before we sort of started work really. But finding those tracks gave us a lot of hope, and then that summer another team went and found a live snipe. The following summer, a live snipe plus a juvenile snipe. So pretty much that gave us, just confirmed that things were all underway.
Since we removed the invasive predators from Campbell Island, the wildlife has bounced back. We've seen an explosion of life and a return of species that hadn't been seen for decades. But it's still a fragile balance, and our delicate island ecosystems worldwide need our help to heal and flourish. That's why the Campbell Island rat eradication was such a game changer. It paved the way for future island operations by creating a robust framework that others could follow. And
having shown that worked, pretty much that methodology became the blueprint for a number of other operations. So the next one, we had guys from Macquarie Island came on when we were doing the operation as observers, and they ended up doing it, I think it was the following year or very soon after, they went and did the same thing on Macquarie, which was ultimately successful as well. So they pretty much used the same sort of methodology we use, and that methodology has now been used all around the world at a whole range of eradication, the Aleutian Islands, islands off California, Mexico. So it's become a standard operating procedure really that's been replicated right in the world. South Georgia is probably the largest one to date. It's about 80,000 hectares. So also been successful. So it formed the basis of a methodology that could be replicated and used elsewhere around the world.
So really, I mean, in terms of the global context in pest eradication from islands, Campbell Island was where you took some proven small-scale tests and you turned that into something that's now changing the world's islands. Yeah,
basically, yeah. So we refined that process, got it down to an efficient model with lower sowing rates, and that demonstrated it could work in challenging terrain, and that's been replicated again and again and again. So it's just like a normal thing around the world now to do large island eradication. So pretty cool, yeah.
What are the biggest challenges facing the birds and other biodiversity of Campbell Island these days?
I think in terms of like the albatross species, for example, the big challenge really is around things away from the island. So they fly away from the island, they're getting basically caught still on long lines and hanging up with fishing. So the fishing industry is probably still, I mean, there's a lot of advances being made in how to minimise that, and they're doing a lot of work on it, but there is still some big threats from the fishing industry. So in terms of other ones, I guess it's the maintaining our biosecurity is a big thing. So being vigilant, keep making sure we don't get rats or other organisms back on there. I think some of the other big risks are things we don't really understand and probably can't control, like with the penguin population there. The eastern rockhopper has declined from probably around about 600,000-700,000 pairs down to about 30,000 pairs in the last sort of like since the 1940s.
So rockhopper penguin decline is pretty catastrophic, and not just on Campbell but the other New Zealand subantarctics too. And the main drivers are thought to be climate change, in short. The exact causes we don't know, but it could be that a changing in water temperature is pushing prey further south, and in doing so it's meaning that the adults are having to work much harder to get down to that zone. And by the time they get down there, they're still going, they're still alive, they can feed themselves, but then that journey back to feed chicks is a really energy heavy journey, so they actually don't have very much left to feed the chicks with, and that could be one driver. Or it could be a change in the climate on the island, so potentially things like increased rainfall, dowsing chicks, causing them to suffer through exposure.
And these challenges that our subantarctic islands are facing aren't just localised problems. There are also megatrends at play that our wildlife need to contend with going forward.
So we know that things like El Nino and La Nina have really big impacts on seabirds, and when you have these large-scale changes in oceanic waters, and particularly warmings and coolings, you're going to have knock-on effects to anything that is based around these regions. And in the case of Campbell, you can pretty well assume that the vast majority of species have some form of connection with the ocean, and so we are likely to see some big changes over the coming years. And one thing we've already noticed is just the arrival of newer species, so things like the black shag or great cormorant actually coming down to Campbell. Until recently, Campbell, the Auckland Islands, the Bounties, they all had their own endemic species of shag. Now we're seeing black shags seemingly colonising, and we don't know what's going to happen. Will they remain? Will they outcompete your Campbell Island shag? We just don't know yet, but we can be pretty confident that there will be changes.
So there you have it. We've explored Campbell Island's jagged and inspiring history, from exploitation to preservation. Today, the New Zealand Subantarctic Islands are one of New Zealand's UNESCO World Heritage sites. It's clear that Campbell Island has been a key foundation in the island eradication movement over the last 20 years. But what insights can we take away from this story? And what needs to change to create an environment that we'd be proud to pass on to future generations?
Yeah, I think it's around just really valuing our wild places and our wildlife. So just building on that, educating people, giving people a chance to experience, like we've been doing on this trip. So experiencing wild places and building a real valuing of that. Because I mean, it's really hard now to get funding, for example, for the Auckland Island eradication, $80 million, a lot of money. The same token, we'll go and spend a couple $100 million on a sports stadium somewhere. So it's around upping it, just looking at what we value and why we value it. So to me, placing a higher value on these special places and special flora and fauna, that's the number one thing. And then just as a result of that, developing the will to want to do something about it, to keep these wild places and improve the places we've already got that maybe aren't as in good a condition but could be and should be and could be. You've got to keep pushing the boundaries and don't be put off by the naysayers. So I think that's at a higher level, the biggest learning is around keep pushing the boundaries. At an operational level, the biggest learning was around we developed the recipe for eradicating rats off islands, or off the mainland as well for that matter.
Experiencing Campbell Island and other remote subantarctic islands is a privilege. In fact, it can be life-changing. Joining a voyage with Heritage Expeditions brings you a biodiversity-rich, unique adventure with a crew that's made up of scientists, naturalists, and other experts in their field. They give insightful presentations on the places you visit, and they're always there to answer your questions. We came on board as recipients of their True Young Explorer Scholarship. This program enables young people who are at the early stages of their careers to be inspired by these wild places. Thank you to Heritage for making our journey and this video possible. And thank you for watching. If you found this mini documentary insightful, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to get more content like this in the future.